Tomorrow, I finally go home. The twin suns of Penal Colony 49 hung high in the sky, casting merciless rays that turned everything into rust-red haze. The man swung his hammer, each strike reverberating through his aching body. His back screamed, his arms burned, but he never stopped. Day 3649, he reminded himself. Just one more day. In the solitude of his cell that evening, he knelt before the wall, his fingers tracing the forest of tally marks he had carved over the years. They stretched down to the floor like a silent testament to his endurance. He closed his eyes, summoning the images that had kept him alive through it all, Clara's laughter as she spun Amelia in the garden. Sophie's sleepy whispers when he kissed her goodnight. The chime of wind bells on their front porch. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, I'll see them again. He could still feel the shame of the act that brought him here, a stolen ration card, taken in desperation to feed his starving daughters. The price had been steep, 10 years in this hellish wasteland, under relentless suns, his body bent and broken. But he had survived, clinging to the hope of going home. The morning of his release dawned with a quiet anticipation that thrummed in his chest. The gates of the penal colony loomed before him, their iron frame a threshold to freedom. A tattered satchel hung over his shoulder, filled with 10 years of meager belongings. His grayed hair caught in the wind as he scanned the horizon, already imagining Clara standing at the dock, her arms outstretched. 2 guards approached, their visors glinting black under the suns. One handed him a sleek datapad, its screen alive with cold, sterile text. Penitentiary release form, it read. His fingers trembled as he scrolled down. Date sentenced, February 2nd, 2087. A date etched into his memory like a scar. Date released, February 2nd, 2315. The air seemed to collapse around him. His breath hitched as his eyes darted over the numbers again and again. What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking. The guard's reply was devoid of emotion, as if reciting a line he'd said 1,000 times before. Standard time dilation. Interstellar sentencing protocols apply. Earth has experienced a temporal lapse of 228 years during your 10-year sentence. The words hit him like a hammer blow. The satchel slipped from his shoulder, thudding to the ground. "No," he whispered, his voice raw. "No, that's impossible. They're waiting for me," he shouted, desperation rising in his chest. "Clara. My girls. There." The guard didn't flinch, didn't offer sympathy. Just cold silence. He dropped to his knees, his hands gripping the datapad as if crushing it could change the truth. His shoulders heaved with sobs, the tears carving trails through the dust on his face. "I worked for them," he murmured, trembling. "Every day, I survived for them. I survived just to go home." The guard said nothing. Time stretched endlessly as he sat there, the colony's barren landscape stretching out around him. In his mind, Clara and the girls began to blur, their faces slipping into shadows. Their laughter, their voices, the garden, the chimes, all of it faded, swallowed by the void of years he'd never lived. He tried to hold on to them, to anchor himself in their memory, but it was like clutching sand. In the end, space and time had stolen everything. Even love.
The rain drummed against the car windows as I pulled into the driveway of my grandmother's house. Emily, my 6-year-old daughter, hopped out, clutching her little blue raincoat around her. "Hang your coat up, sweetheart," I said, pushing the door open. Emily peeled off her raincoat and woolly hat, tossing them onto the hallway table before racing inside. "Nan," she squealed, her voice bright. I lingered in the doorway, taking a moment to steady myself. 3 years ago, everything had changed. I'll never forget that day. My grandmother collapsing in the kitchen, her hands trembling violently. The stroke left her frail, her words locked away behind a silence she couldn't break. Yet somehow, she'd held on. Through physical therapy, determination, and something else entirely, she had survived. Her therapist recommended knitting, something simple to strengthen her hands and occupy her mind. But what began as a harmless pastime quickly turned into something much darker. "Nan, guess what happened at school today?" Emily chirped, her voice carrying from the living room. I followed and found her sitting by my grandmother's side, chatting away about her day. My grandmother nodded faintly, her gaze distant. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it was almost always nonsense. But her knitting spoke volumes. At first, it was subtle, a patch of gray clouds woven into a scarf the day before a freak hailstorm. Then, larger and more vivid patterns began to emerge. Entire landscapes and symbols appeared on her quilts. Warnings, I realized too late, of disasters to come. In June, she knitted a lush forest in hues of red and green. 2 days later, news broke of a devastating wildfire in the Amazon. In July, her needles danced across black waves speckled with tiny animals. That very evening, a cargo ship capsized, drowning countless creatures in the Gulf of Mexico. Coincidence? Maybe. But deep down, I knew better. Once, I tried to stop her, snatching a nearly finished quilt from her trembling hands. Her heart monitor spiked wildly, and I froze. I couldn't bear to see her in pain. She wasn't causing these tragedies. At least, I didn't think so. She was tuned into something. Something I didn't understand. Every week, I came back. Every week, I sat beside her, trying to decipher her woven prophecies. But today was different. I dropped Emily off at her father's and drove to my grandmother's house. As I stepped inside, I was struck by an eerie stillness. The faint hum of her heart monitor was the only sound. "Gran," I called, but there was no response. Then I saw them, her knitting needles snapped in two on the floor. My chest tightened. "What's the prediction today?" I asked, my voice strained, trying to mask my unease. I picked up the quilt from her lap, its threads heavier than usual. My fingers traced the intricate patterns, the symbols almost screaming at me. A blue jacket. A woolly hat. Emily's blue jacket. Her woolly hat. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned to my grandmother. For the first time in months, her eyes locked onto mine. A single tear slid down her weathered cheek, cutting through the silence like a scream. The room felt like it was closing in. My mind raced. Was this a warning? A plea? Or something more sinister? I didn't have answers, only a dreadful certainty that my life, and Emily's, was on the brink of unraveling, just like the threads of my grandmother's haunting tapestries.
They called it Implantation Day, the day my life and my body stopped being mine. Growing up, my mother told us stories of a world before everything changed. Before the barren years, when women could conceive and birth children naturally. Before the mutation, when men discovered they could reproduce on their own, it should have been a miracle. Instead, it became a curse for us. Men could create life, but women were still the carriers. By law, we had to give birth, a duty enshrined as sacred, patriotic, and inescapable. I was 18 when they implanted me. If I didn't marry, I'd be labeled unfit. If I refused the implant, I'd be sent to the camps. So, I accepted the pregnancy, a tiny, foreign life growing inside me from a father I didn't know, didn't choose, and didn't want. The nausea was relentless, leaving me hollow-cheeked and weak. My body wasn't my own anymore. It was a vessel, a shell. I hated every second of it. The day I met Jasper started like any other, a slow trudge through my routine. I was at a used bookstore, stretching to reach a book on a high shelf, when a voice startled me. "Need some help?" I turned to see him. Tall, lanky, with sandy hair falling into his curious, dark eyes. He smiled and reached for the book, handing it to me with an easy confidence. "Thanks," I muttered, adjusting the bag of groceries weighing down my arm. He glanced at my rounded belly, his smile faltering into something softer. When are you due? Any day now. My voice was tight. Let me help you, he offered, gesturing to the bags. I'm Jasper. I should have said no. Every instinct screamed to send him away, but I was too tired to argue. Lily, I mumbled. Jasper followed me home, carrying the groceries with a practiced ease. Inside, he unpacked the bags without asking and made coffee while I collapsed onto the threadbare couch I'd found on Craigslist. So, he called from the kitchen. How far along did you say you are? Almost there, I replied, rubbing my belly. But as I reached for the coffee, a wave of dizziness washed over me. My tongue felt heavy, my vision swimming. The mug slipped from my hands, shattering on the floor. Whoa, careful. Jasper was there in an instant, his arms catching me as my knees buckled. I tried to speak, but my body refused to obey. The world blurred and dimmed, Jasper's face looming above me. You're okay, he whispered, his voice strangely calm. Then I saw it, the gleam of a knife in his hand. Panic surged, but my limbs were useless, dead weight against his grip. I knew I'd find her, he murmured, his fingers cold against my stomach. When they took her from me, when they cut her out, I felt hollow, empty. His smile stretched, too wide, too eager. But I tracked her down. My little girl. They told me I wasn't fit to be a father, but they were wrong. I'll take care of her. I'll give her toys, a bed, and maybe even teach her tricks. I managed a weak gasp, my body jerking against his grip as the cold edge of the blade touched my skin. No, I croaked, but he only laughed, the sound sharp and unhinged. Don't worry, Jasper cooed, dragging the knife across my belly with horrifying precision. You won't need her anymore. She's mine now, my baby. I screamed as white-hot pain exploded through me, his laughter echoing in my ears. After all, he whispered, leaning close, his breath cold against my ear. I've always wanted a pet. Darkness swallowed me, his voice the last thing I heard.